precisely the same thing. So it's entirely plausible that they genuinely did not know. But among the initiatives Ukrainians have launched is to film captured soldiers, stating their names, their addresses, and if they have parents amongst. If they do have parents, to give them a cell phone and tell them that they're allowed to call their mother and tell her where they are. They then inform the mother that Ukrainian forces are entirely willing to hand over her son. She just needs to come to Ukraine to collect him. So for those Russians who buy into the narrative that Russian forces are in Ukraine to protect Russians, and that there's no war in Ukraine, are suddenly in a quandary. Similarly, then showing those films on the internet, available for the entire world to see, and they show then these conscripts as hungry, ill-equipped, unwilling, and young, confused children, truly, in Zelensky's words. But what these confused children now are prisoners of war. And the Ukrainians have used these films of captured Russian soldiers in an attempt to rouse the Russian population to audibly and visibly protest Putin's war and to more generally embarrass Moscow. They've also created a hotline where information as to which soldiers have been killed or have been wounded, where, when and where they might have died, how they might have died. And these lists are also available on the internet for mothers of conscripts to see. And it's also important to note that in this part of the world, it's very common to have only one child. So if a son, an 18-year-old son, is killed in a war, that's it. The loss is really tremendous. The use of social media also bespeaks the perils of trying to conduct a military operation among two peoples that speak the same language and look the same and have common reference points. There's been a tremendous use of individuals filming their encounters with soldiers. And what strikes me is that a tremendous use of women filming their encounters with soldiers. Unarmed women, very often with children in tow, standing up to Russian soldiers. And in fact, appealing to them, if you will, appealing to them as human beings. And when these encounters are recorded and then shared widely on the internet, it becomes something of a PR effort to rehumanize an otherwise grossly inhumane war, and to reintroduce basic standards of human decency and empathy in an effort to try to provoke Russians to agitate against this war at home. And they do this because although receiving weapons is of course quite, and mercenaries too, that mercenaries play an ever greater role in this war, receiving weapons and mercenaries is certainly helpful. And of course, sanctions are certainly good, but it's important to note that although the sanctions have certainly are being felt in Russia, the real impact or the fullest impact of those sanctions will come later. And the problem is Ukraine is being bombed now. So these images of captured soldiers, of confused children that are then projected back to Russia, and in particular to Russian mothers, is a far more immediate and emotive, urgent tactic to provoke Russians, as we have Khodorkovsky, who's a Russian, oh, I could take this off, I forgot, who ran afoul of Mr. Putin and now is no longer in Russia, as he famously implored his Russian compatriots. He suggested that they all should take 15 days for Ukraine. And what he meant by that is initially when protests erupted in Russia, those who protested and were arrested were given 15 days in prison. And he suggested that if every Russian was willing to take 15 days for Ukraine, that would overwhelm all aspects of this repressive system and make it collapse. Precisely because ever greater numbers of Russians were willing to take that risk. If you follow the news, you know that something that comes very, very dangerously close to martial law has been implemented in Russia. There are now threats of prison sentences up to 15 years for anyone that refers to this war as a war, it must be called an operation. And anyone who says anything that disparages or in any way is negative, what the state is allowed to deem fake news, could be punished by up to 15 years in prison. And one of the reasons why they are forced into such draconian measures against their own people is because they are losing this battle for the hearts and minds of people. They are losing the information war. There have been already protests in 57 cities in Russia, but also over 6,000 protesters arrested. And one of the reasons why they're losing this information war and they are forced to adopt such severe repressive measures against citizens who choose to protest is because their use of information is tactically quite different. I think of it as the theft of history. These kleptocrats have not only stolen money and property and resources, they've also stolen history. And what I mean by that is this. When Mr. Putin claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and that is what justifies his campaign of denazification in order to stop the genocide in Eastern Ukraine, he is tumbling so many different concepts together in a highly contorted way that this sows confusion. It sows confusion about who is who, about what happened in the past. And it, as I said earlier, it produces a certain kind of ignorance. And in the process, it destroys truth. And that's why for many Russians, they don't know what to think of what is going on in Ukraine. That is to say, those Russians who are dependent on state-controlled media in Russia. I just want to end by saying a word or two about the use of this word denazification as a justification, even legitimation for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He says he seeks to denazify the government in Ukraine because Russia and Ukraine are one people. That is to say, then, much like the US government would protect US citizens abroad, then the Russian government must protect Russians abroad. Right there, you have a sleight of hand. If you speak Russian, suddenly you're a Russian. Russian is widely spoken in Ukraine. So using such a flexible, one could generously say, such a wide understanding as to what constitutes an identity, let alone citizenship, this then becomes license to invade, to protect those people against the Nazis in their own government. But as perhaps many of you know, the president of Ukraine is himself a Jew. His grandfather was the only survivor of his own family during World War II. And among the targets that Russian forces have hit is Babi Yar, which is one of the most significant memorials to literally Jewish genocide in Eastern Europe. And so by tumbling all of these concepts together, he guts them of their meaning. He sows confusion and destroys truth and makes it difficult for anyone to genuinely understand what he's thinking. And this is why I think we have so much speculation as, is he mad or is he not mad? Part of that stems from this jumbled narrative that he uses. But I would simply suggest that this is part of a calculated effort to label things what they are not, to create alternative facts, to create an entirely different narrative that will garner some form of allegiance for him and for this horrific invasion that he has now embarked upon. I think it's clear that in many places, certainly in North America and Europe, Putin's narrative has not caught on, and the Ukrainian narrative certainly has. The problem is the Ukrainian narrative is first and foremost oriented towards Russians, and they need to be victorious with that narrative in Russia, and I think they still are not yet. Having said that, I think it's important to watch for other parts of the world. If you notice the UN resolution, certain very key states like China and India abstained from voting. It's unclear how they are reacting to not just the military invasion, but what their position will be on this information war that is setting up two diametrically opposed interpretations as to what is happening on the ground. Perhaps I'll leave it there, and thank you once again for coming, and I'll be happy to speak to questions that you might have.
Thank you. Apologies, you carried on, you moved right on, and I do apologize. What's happening is at home we are having sound difficulties. We did test the system before, but as you can tell, we have a lot of people online, so this is a big problem. I think we have figured out a workaround. It will be a little clunky in the Q&A, but with apologies for all the disruption in the middle of your speaking. So we will now move to Dean Roush, and I will let you have your 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to address this topic. I'll be coming at it from a very different perspective from my colleagues from the military and political standpoint. What I hope to do is share with you at least a description of a more than 30-year history of Penn State's engagement in Ukraine, but also as an agriculturalist, what we're always very concerned about food security around the world, because we know that food insecurity leads to political instability as well as human misery. There are big implications for what's happening for all of these. So in the context of being concerned about food security, long before I arrived at Penn State, I was convinced that the two most important countries to watch for world agriculture in the future were Brazil and Ukraine. Over the last 2 decades, both countries have had higher variability in the reduction in exports than most other agriculturally inclined countries, and far beyond the levels you expect when the variability is introduced by weather or market instability. Still, both Brazil and Ukraine have the capacity, they can improve their adoption of technology, logistics, and governance to have an outsized impact on world food security. And so I've had a long-term interest in Ukraine dating from my first visit there in 2005. In broad generalities across the university, we seek international collaboration to advance our understanding of other cultures, our research in science and other disciplines with collaborators in those countries, and we look forward to the education of our students, including gaining their own international experiences. In the agricultural sciences, we're particularly interested in countries from which we can learn from our own practices and share research advice. And frankly, we want to try to make sure that our students understand something about the competition and markets that are out there in the future for their careers. So we do this in the context of agriculture, that agriculture in rural development is an important research area in itself, as well as key to healthy, open, and democratic societies. Thus, when I was amazed and pleased to learn months after I arrived at Penn State, a long-standing relationship between the College of Agricultural Sciences with Ukraine, the network that was already established, in large part due to the philanthropy of the Woskow family of State College. Over the past 30 years, the college has focused on agriculture and rural development in open and democratic society as a key to our partnership with Ukraine. Starting on the heels of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Woskow family made their first gift to Penn State in 1992 to build ties in the agriculture sphere as a foundation for the Ukraine. Alex and Helen Woskow had fled the Soviet Union to the United States. And somewhat pathetically, in his 2004 memoirs, Alex stated that he wanted his book to remind people that what is precious can easily be taken away, and that a vigilant commitment to democracy is imperative for Ukraine's independence. The Woskows knew the importance of agriculture as a foundation of democracy and financial prosperity, and grew their gift over the ensuing years. George and Nina Woskow now have personally been engaged with what we were doing. They challenged our vision to move more in the direction of land reform than just simple agricultural and business practices. Many other Ukrainians also came to Pennsylvania, given the similar climate and agricultural conditions. Pennsylvania is home to 15 of the 20 largest Ukrainian communities by percentage in the United States. So our ties as a state to Ukraine are strong. Coming back to the agricultural powerhouse, Ukraine has long been known as the breadbasket of Europe, based in part on the rich black soils, which are very similar to those of Iowa. Ukraine is thus of strategic importance to feeding the world, which has already been compromised by the Russian invasion. Since the time of the ancient Egyptians, the key to food security in many areas of the world has been grain. It's a source of protein and calories that can be stored and shipped around the world. Still, despite the importance of this, our link to grain shipments is tenuous. Only about 10 to 20% of the world grain production is actually traded internationally, especially with two key crops, wheat and corn. Among the top producers, Russia trades about 18% of the total wheat exports, with the US second at 14%, Ukraine fifth at 8%. In corn, the United States is first at 26%, Ukraine fourth at 13%. In short, Russia and Ukraine combined control about 30% of the world's corn and wheat exports. Of course, they won't be controlling 30% of it over this year or the next few years, because there won't be any significant amount of grain produced for export in Ukraine. The devastation already wrought by the war will prevent access to fuel and other essential infrastructure to be able to plant the crop this spring, much less harvest it to be shared with the areas that are dependent on Asia. So Russia has not only had a 10% increase in its potential share in the grain market, but won't be able to realize it in the foreseeable future. So we can expect that the outcome will be of the Russian invasion will be food insecurity in several countries. Our college's links with Ukraine are deeply meaningful, and over the last several years, we have hosted nearly 500 Ukrainian scholars for a semester on campus to conduct research, boost their teaching and outreach skills, and build new networks in support of change. We supported 25 Penn State students to study for short terms in Ukraine and hosted 6 students here. We conducted a major conference on biofuels. They conducted extensive training in food safety, as well as dairy, no-till agriculture, and agricultural trade. We signed 8 agreements with universities in Ukraine and sponsored 12 administrative visits to our campus and community. We were on the cusp of a major new initiative to support Ukraine's land reform effort, which would magnify those capabilities by encouraging more private ownership and investment. The trend was so positive in putting Ukraine on track for its goals for the connection to the West and protection against from its neighbor to the East. In short, we can't wait to get Ukraine back to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Dean Houck, we are going to have you present next, and we will then have Mary Beth Long go last. We're going to have to fiddle with the sound when Mary Beth Long speaks. Thank you.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon at this point, everybody. And on behalf of the Penn State Law and the School of International Affairs, I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for being here, as well as our panelists, Dr. Wanner and Dean Roush, and Professor / Assistant Secretary, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Mary Beth Long. And it's maybe fitting that we're sitting in a law school. I wanted to say a few words about where has the law gone? What is the role of law in all of this? And then to reflect on that in a couple of very specific ways, relating to what you're all hearing about in terms of war crimes, for one thing, sanctions for another, and the shoe that has not yet dropped, but if it does, we should be very concerned about it, which is that of cyber. When people hear the term international law, they tend to think of law the way that we think of it in our own domestic jurisdictions. Here in the United States, where you have somebody who makes laws and the police force who enforces laws, and there's a real strict system of accountability for that. And when they realize that it doesn't work that way in the international domain, people tend to start with high aspirations and very idealistic about what international law should do. And when they find out that it doesn't work that way, many people often flip and become very despairing and cynical about the role of law. And the fact of the matter is that it's somewhere in between. And as we watch the horrific events that have already taken place, and no doubt more that are going to follow, it's useful to reflect on what role law plays in this. And I think law in general is important as a way to express the international community's values and sense of justice about what is going on right now. Because if we didn't have international law, which is the law between nations, our conversation about what's happening would be very different and much more chaotic than it is. And as Dr. Wanner referred to a few minutes ago, we have the glass half full event of a couple of days ago where the UN General Assembly, where 140 odd nations condemned Russia's behavior. There were 35 for their own reasons who chose to abstain, and a grand total of 4 who chose to vote against the resolution. So we ought to find some optimism in that. What's difficult about international law is that it lacks the clear and authoritative enforcement mechanisms that we're used to in our own domestic legal systems. And so that's why people sometimes feel like there is no law and that the world is chaos. But I hope in this 120 seconds, you'll have a more nuanced view of the way that international law works, because it is a forum for articulating what most civilized nations, most of the time, feel about the way nations ought to react with each other. And so, to state the obvious, what everybody has called out is the fact that Russia has violated international law in a variety of ways already, and will no doubt continue to. Not the least of which is by invading the sovereign territory of a sovereign nation, notwithstanding the fact that Vladimir Putin wants to obscure that fact in his information war. And also in the area of war crimes. And in a nutshell, as you'll be hearing a lot about them, it's important to know that our international humanitarian law, as it's sometimes called, or the law of war, as it's sometimes referred to, are those norms and values that the international community has assembled and put together, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly in the wake of World War II, embodied in what you have no doubt heard of, the Geneva Conventions, and a variety of other sources of international law. And very simply, these laws are designed to do a couple of important things, which are relevant today. Number one, to protect civilians, to ensure that civilians are protected and that in the chaos and the horror of war, that only military objects and military people are considered legitimate targets of war. Number one. Number two, the law of armed conflict is designed to prevent unnecessary suffering, not only of civilians, but from the people who are actually authorized to be participating in fighting. And this becomes relevant when we start talking about things like cluster munitions or thermobaric weapons, these so far vacuum bombs that you've heard discussed. All of these are addressed by the law of armed conflict and the law of war. But there are a couple of nuances that are important to understand, and are going to be especially important to understand as Vladimir Putin engages in what Dr. Wanner has so ably described as his information war and his attempts to obscure and confuse everybody. It is not prohibited under the law to kill civilians in armed conflict. So, for example, if civilians begin to fight and take up to fight, they become legitimate targets. If civilians are in the vicinity of a valid military target, there are choices to be made under the law of war when it's nonetheless legitimate to hit that target. And if there is civilian damage, what we sometimes refer to collateral damage, that collateral damage is sometimes, it may surprise you, under the law of armed conflict, permissible and justified under the law of war. So no doubt in the days ahead, we will see instances where at first blush, it seems as if Russia has grossly violated the law of war and committed war crimes by targeting civilians. And in many cases, they will have done just that. But expect Vladimir Putin and the Russian state to attempt to use some of the nuances in the law of armed conflict to say that these civilians were fighting us. These civilians were hiding in cultural institutions and in civilian buildings, and therefore we were justified to go attack them. And the fact of the matter is, it's going to be very important to know what the facts were and to know a little bit more about the particular circumstances that may have led to what happened. None of this, of course, is to justify anything that Putin's doing, but it is to point out that he will have some avenues to try to confuse people and exploit people by taking advantage of some of the legitimate provisions in the law of armed conflict. Which is worth saying a word about something, the institution that is probably not a household name, but you may be hearing more about in the days ahead, something called the International Criminal Court, which has already opened investigations into Russian war crimes. The International Criminal Court does not have quite the power that you might hope it would have in a circumstance like this. It is a gathering of states who have agreed by treaty to participate in the investigation and the prosecution and the enforcement of international criminal law. Russia is not a party to that treaty. And the United States is not a party to that treaty. And Ukraine is not a party to that treaty. However, Ukraine has said that if violations take place on its territory, it has given the court permission to act on violations of the law of armed conflict within Ukraine. So in the days ahead, when you hear about the International Criminal Court conducting investigations about war crimes, just know that it's an important entity, but its jurisdiction and its enforcement capabilities are not comprehensive and not necessarily going to be easy to implement against Russia. Having said that, time has a long memory. People have long memories. And if at some point, if a Russian general who is responsible for war crimes attempts to travel, that Russian general might be seized and subjected to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And we can only hope that if there is sometimes regime change in Russia and the Russian state itself decides to hold people accountable for what's going on today, that would be another mechanism of which war crimes can be enforced. Last two things I want to say really quickly are to point out the really significant role of sanctions in this process. And if you want to talk about that, that's something that we can discuss. And finally, the role of cyber. As we advocate for tougher actions against Russia, it's appropriate and understandable that that advocacy would come, but we do need to be aware that the Russian state, which has not used nuclear weapons, but as Putin has intimated might come in play at some point. Of course, they attacked a civilian reactor last night. They have used cyber in the past, and they've used it recently, and they've used it ruthlessly. And so, again, that's something that we may want to talk about, but thank you.
Thank you, Dean Houck. We are now going to have Mary Beth Long speak, and I apologize, Mary Beth, we will have to play with the sound in order to ensure everyone can hear you.
That's great.
Give me the signal.
That's great. Can you hear me? If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. But first of all, I want to thank the university and for these esteemed experts for even being asked to participate. SIA has become such a great home for me that I'm delighted to be included in this August group. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. And as I tell all my students, as we look at the amount of information today, it's really important for each and every time that you receive information that you try to figure out where the person is coming from and what agenda they may have, so you can distinguish between what is the truth, what is a truth. So I'm going to be coming at this discussion from my former DOD hat, and not my professor hat. My very first assignment as the CIA was I was involved in an undercover operation that was in the late 80s that was focused on Ukraine and Russia, and spent quite a bit while Ukraine was disassociating itself from the Soviet Union. And then while I was at the Department of Defense, of course, I was the senior policy person advising the Secretary of Defense on NATO expansion from 2006 to 2009. So I had the opportunity and frankly the honor to represent the USG and NATO on expansion. So what I thought I would do is really break down my comments into four main parts. And the first one is just sort of from my point of view, how we got here. Then secondly, what were the watershed moments that brought us to this particular sequence of events. And then thirdly, where are we? There's a lot of information that's being exchanged. And I thought the conversation, to the extent that I could hear it, on the narratives and the use of media and propaganda and framing the context of the story was really excellent. Earlier this week, my class got to speak with Peter Singer, who does a number of really interesting examinations, including the use of mass media in war. But I learned a lot from the professor, so thank you so much. And then finally, I thought I'd just sort of close in what I see as what might be the most likely way forward. So in how we got here, just to sort of recap, in the early 2000s, really, Ukraine as at that point, Europe's poorest nation, but also geographically its largest physical nation other than the Soviet Union, as well as other Soviet bloc countries, were starting to feel around with the West regarding support for disassociating themselves from the Soviet Empire or the Soviet Union. And as I assumed office really in 2006, 2007, the dialogue had already been under discussion for some time about what NATO was going to do with these former Soviet republics, or as some people would say, the near abroad. That's the sort of the Soviet point of view from a foreign policy perspective, and what the rest of the West would do with NATO aspirants. And at that point, we knew that from the Ukraine and Georgia perspective in particular, we were going to get a lot of pushback from Russia. We also knew that Ukraine had signed basically a security arrangement with Russia that made Russia basically responsible for protecting Ukraine, in part and parcel for Ukraine having given up its nuclear capabilities. About a third of Russia's nuclear capabilities at that point in time sat in Ukraine, including its nuclear weaponry. And then we also knew that there were a lot of people in Russia. We didn't know Putin then, other than his KGB background. I think up until the late 1990s, he was a bureaucrat, a politician, but he was certainly rising. And there certainly were people in Russia that were, I would say, remnants of the 1950s, the Soviet Empire. And we knew that they in particular hadn't quite gotten over what they would describe as the humiliation of the 1980s, the late 80s when the Soviet Union collapsed, and that there was a real desire to get the band back again, but they weren't really ready to disassociate themselves, particularly from Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia. We also knew that there were ongoing violations by Russia in a number of different realms, that Putin in particular and his predecessors were willing to violate international law, and that they were willing to take action to probe the West and see how much the West was willing to put up with. And that the frozen conflicts, these border areas that my class knows about, Abkhazia, of course, the Donbass region and others bordering on Moldova and Poland in particular, that these World War II sort of quasi-independent zones had not been really cemented as to where they were between Russian territory and part of the other bordering nations. So during the conversations with NATO, I'm going to have the pleasure on Friday to actually be I guess a referee, some might say, with and preside over a CFR, the Council of Foreign Relations discussion about NATO expansion, and Michael Mendenbaum will be there. If any of those, if you've read his pieces, I'm sure he and I will disagree on just about everything I'm about to say from here on forward. But at the time, NATO made the decision that any European country that decided that it wanted to join the West, whether it wanted to do so through the EU, whether it wanted to do through economic and cultural arrangements, or if it wanted to apply to NATO and met the requirements of NATO, that they would not be dissuaded, that the requirements would be a hurdle enough, but that NATO nor the West wanted to be in the position of allowing these newly freed nations to choose for themselves and to choose what realm or what orbit they wanted to be associated with. And that we understood at the time that it would take sometimes years, maybe decades, for particularly countries like the Ukraine and Georgia to sort themselves out as far as how Republican and how liberal and how free they wanted to be, or whether they wanted to continue to be within the orbits of Russia, but that those were determinations that were sovereign, and that NATO would then expand to the extent that aspirants could meet NATO's requirements. I think what happened really to create the bulk of the situation that we have today happened in 2014, when Putin really sort of brought together along of a number of disparate actions in which he was probing the West. And that, of course, was his incremental annexation of Crimea. The pattern that we're seeing now in Ukraine is exactly the pattern that he used in Crimea, and that was to start making noises through narratives, as the professor pointed out, about Russian speakers who were being persecuted and even prosecuted, that there was violence perpetrated against Russian speakers. There was a concerted effort over years to make sure that Russian speakers and those who had long worked and maybe even felt Russian backgrounds, those who worked on the Black Sea Fleet in particular, were then given Russian passports and encouraged to view themselves as Russian citizens, although perhaps Ukraine-born. And then finally, in 2014, this narrative of, well, we need to go in and protect these people, that they are being perpetrated, violence is being perpetrated against them, ended up leading to the annexation of Crimea. And I would say that this land grab, arguably one of the larger, if not the largest since World War II, was not met effectively by the West at all, and certainly not by the United States. We were late to impose sanctions, and those sanctions, you can characterize them any way you want, but they certainly didn't dissuade the annexation. And that sort of set the precedent, I think. And what I think happened over the years with the incursions on Georgian territory, and then most recently on Ukraine, was Putin realized that the West would first respond with pretty much the pattern that we had set up, responding to the pattern that he used, which he used again, which was sanctions, something of a disparate approach to sanctions, and that those would be too little too late to actually prevent him from what is usually his fairly successful bring in the special forces first and then follow on with conventional military. And it almost worked in these circumstances, but it didn't. So where does that leave us? I don't really know how much time I have. Am I moving? Should I turn it off here or should I go ahead? Dr. Ransom.
I don't know that you can hear me. Can you hear me? Oh, excellent. Anytime you want to wrap up, we'll turn to Q&A because you definitely have quite a few questions online.
Okay, I'll quickly give a quick and dirty about where I think we are. We've got the largest refugee flight since World War II coming out of Ukraine. The conflict isn't sustainable at this point. And I think, as the professor noted, you've got a Putin who has lost face, who has cracked down on his domestic population, who does seem ill-informed about what is going on. And you have a desperate leader who will resort to desperate measures. The initial attempts by Putin to put his Spetsnaz and strike forces in order to pave the way for the military did not work for a number of reasons, but he's going to make up for that by night flight attacks. As you'll see, those are increasing. These will be against civilian populations, but primarily infrastructure, in order to create devastation, to create a psychological impact on the Ukrainians. And he's going for a personal collapse of the Ukrainian people and country by indiscriminate killing, and it's going to be horrific. But he's also going to try to decapitate the government. He's been unsuccessful so far, but he can't afford to give that up. His next move will have to be to cut off Ukraine's supply, and he'll do that, of course, through the Black Sea, moving into the lower port. That probably will be successful if the US isn't able, or NATO, to keep him from taking Odessa port, which will cut off all supply lines to internally Ukraine. Let's be clear, there's a lot of information out there. This was an unprovoked attack. It is going to be very difficult at this point for Zelensky and others to negotiate anything but capitulation. The real question is, once Putin gets Ukraine and gets control of the territory, there's plenty of left behind that will keep his forces that follow in on his strikes occupied. They call them fifth column. And there's some doubt as to whether or not that pot shots and that sort of slow war of attrition is something that he can sustain in front of his population. I think the hope is that he'll be satisfied with that, and then some capitulation on territory in the Donbass, and not go further into either Georgia or some kind of deal with Belarus or neighboring countries. We've got to do something against the humanitarian problems. There is, at this point, nothing on the table, although some discussion of humanitarian sort of flight corridors, which I'm not sure how those can be constructed. Perhaps those can go through Odessa. And I'm on my way actually to Turkey tomorrow to meet with NATO and other countries that are concerned about the deliberate targeting of nuclear facilities, not from a nuclear weapons standpoint, although I don't think those or chemical weapons are off the table, but the deliberate targeting of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, second largest in the world. And although there doesn't seem to be an immediate concern regarding radiation coming out of the plant, it is an extremely dangerous situation. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for letting me just let you know what I know.
Thank you, Mary Beth, much appreciated. We are now going to turn to question and answers. For those in the auditorium, feel free to come down. There's a mic on each side, and you are free to ask your questions. I do know we have some already online, so I'm going to let the Director of Career Services and the School of International Affairs, Grant Lipke, give us the questions, and then you as a panel can decide who would like to respond. I'm going to leave that to you. Just so you're aware, especially Dean Roush, this is the speaker the people at home can hear, so maybe project this way as you're able. Thank you, Grant.
Sure. Beyond economic sanctions, what other steps can the international arena take to ensure that Russia is held responsible for its actions?
Beyond economic sanctions, what additional steps can be taken to ensure that Russia is held accountable for their actions?
Correct.
Well, for my part, I've already started compiling evidence about what has transpired in Ukraine. Every day I receive photographs and descriptions of what people are experiencing and enduring. I think that's a start to just establish some factual basis upon which we can begin to evaluate what has happened, and then afterwards begin to analyze why and try to prevent it in the future.
Would you like me to jump in, or I'm not sure how you're organizing? Are we going
Sure.
down the line?
Yep. Feel free.
Because I didn't hear anything at the beginning, so I wasn't sure how you had it organized. As many of you, I'm sure, know, there are sanctions against now against the central bank and individuals. I think some of the sanctions against individuals and entities, some of those have been in existence since 2014. The US has upped those recently, but there's still, I think, discord, and I'm not entirely sure whether Russia has been removed in its entirety off the SWIFT system, which Germany and some of the other countries were a little late to the table to agreeing with. Also, as you know, the US is spying about 10% of its oil from Russia. We are paying for that oil. There's a movement, I believe, in Congress in order to get the US to stop giving Russia money for those funds. And my understanding is, unfortunately, the Yellen, Secretary Yellen recently gave about 18 or 16 billion dollars worth of vouchers for Russia that now that some on the Hill are upset with, because of those are somewhat fungible, and it basically means if not paying for these kinds of conflicts, certainly directly supporting the Russians so that they can move funds. I also think there needs to be a show of force, certainly in establishing humanitarian corridors or relief, and all of that in particular, I think the US can either lead or certainly contribute to.
Thank you. We have a line here in the auditorium, so I'll go to the first in the auditorium question.
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Bowen. I'm a first year SA student. I have a question for Professor Houck. Do you think the US Navy will take any actions to help Ukraine?
Well, so the question is, would the US Navy, or more broadly, if I can maybe broaden the question a little bit, US military get involved? Certainly, the president has been really as clear, I think, as the president can be at this point, that there is no interest in having US forces or even NATO forces engaged directly in the military conflict. And that presents, Secretary Long may have views on this as well. That's going to present a challenge in the coming days, because it's likely to not get better in Ukraine, and the pressure is going to build to do something more than we're doing. And Secretary Long outlined some of the measures that have already been taken, particularly in the realm of sanctions. There's still more that could be done with respect to sanctions, but even when those things are done, the question will be then what? Because as many have said this morning, Putin is not going to lose face over what's going on in Ukraine. He will do whatever it takes to not lose face. And how long are we going to be prepared to watch that play out? That's going to present some difficult choices. But in the short run, no, I think not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Beth, did you want to add anything?
Just, I know that there are discussions occurring today. I think the General Breedlove, who was our commander of NATO up until, I think during the Obama administration, he may have departed afterward, yesterday publicly presented the idea of if we can't create a no-fly zone, and I think he's entirely correct on that. It's a difficult situation, and something the president has been very clear will not happen for all the legal reasons that the dean knows. There is an idea that he has, which I'm not sure how he would implement, that the US or NATO could somehow create a no-fly humanitarian corridor that would be explicitly used for resupply and for medical evacuation and other. I also understand that there is a little bit of a discussion going on about whether the US Navy and or NATO would, without crossing into territorial waters, perhaps address an effort to block the Russian Navy or the Black Sea Fleet from closing the port of Odessa from resupply for the Ukraine. And that would take positioning of military forces and naval assets. I'm not sure either where that stands. I think the president has been clear that he is not particularly interested in putting US assets on the table in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you. We'll turn to an online question.
Sure.
If I could just add one more note, it is, everybody ought to be very clear that as soon as we start to put forces in proximity to Russian forces in any of these plans, that unintended consequences almost inevitably take place. And I think as Secretary Long has outlined, no doubt there are going to be these discussions about the variety of options, and they should have these discussions. But as soon as we start to put forces in proximity to Russian forces, we had better be prepared for things that we're not counting on happening.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Looking forward, what do you feel will be the most long-term outcomes or consequences of current events, both in Eastern Europe, but also for the world as a whole?
Could you hear that online? Yes, okay. Who would like to take it?
Well, I mentioned the internet, the sort of information war and all the threats to basically establishing facts or establishing some sense of truth, the shattering of that. And I think that becomes compounded by the tremendous loss of trust that is felt on multiple levels. Once again, on a human level between Russians and Ukrainians, which Putin calls one people, but Soviet rhetoric called them fraternal nations. But the point remains that it is a group of people who have a shared historical experience. And I think for a great many people in Ukraine, it was unimaginable. And one of the reasons why so many in Russia just cannot imagine that could ever be true, because it's a little bit like, California attacking Oregon. I mean, it just sounds sort of absurd. Why would that ever happen? So I think that's a long standing. And I think the introduction of these deep fakes and curated images and fabricated films of things that transpired or did not transpire, that's here to stay as well too. I think also, once again, on the staying with the internet and social media, the idea that individuals can participate by, at a bare bones minimum, contributing money or following, they're moved by these images that they see and sounds that they hear, and they contribute money. I'm very, granted, Ukraine is in a tremendously disadvantaged position militarily, economically, and every other which way. But I'm pleased certainly at the activism and engagement and response to human suffering. So I wonder to what extent this kind of crowdsourcing, both crowdsourcing of war and a military response, but crowdsourcing of humanitarian responses, to what extent that might also not be a lasting legacy.
Thank you. I will now go to an auditorium question.
Thank you very much. My question pertains to the likelihood of a military coup. So, building off of what has just been said about the undesirability of NATO intervening militarily, also building off of Professor Wanner's analysis of the information war, particularly as it pertains to draftees, my question for everybody would be, how is the Russian army structured? So you have those young draftees drinking tea and calling them mothers. You also have more seasoned troops in the Donbass and elsewhere. You clearly have mercenaries, and then you have Putin's own Praetorian Guard, which I've read has grown to 400,000 men, which of course adds to his growing isolation, and adds to the fact that he made the great mistake of attacking when he control. So my question to everybody would be, how does that work? I mean, is this an all-volunteer army? How does the draft work in Russia? What do we know about the Russian army?
They have mandatory military service for 2 years for men. It's possible to sneak out of it or slither out of it, I should say, but it's still difficult. So in other words, they're conscripted and drafted into the army. They have not volunteered. They are not there by choice. As to the idea of coup, I understood your question more like, would someone in Putin's inner circle turn on him and turn on him violently? This is a complicated issue. It's, in my understanding, a lot of his inner circle, they participate in the kind of a system in which he has built. That is to say, one of the reasons why sanctions are leveled not just against Putin, but by his inner circle, is because they have a great deal at stake here too. But that means they have a great deal at stake in maintaining Putin in power, because just as Putin understands that should he be, say, overthrown, in a best case scenario, he would probably face life imprisonment. And the problem is many of his closest allies are in a similar situation. So I would like to think someone in that inner circle might revive their moral conscience and at a minimum try to intervene in some kind of a way. But it's important to note that his inner circle, I think, is likely to suffer the same fate that he himself will suffer. And so they have then very much of a vested interest in somehow coming out of this. As to whether that would happen on the army, that's a trickier question, whether the morale is clearly very low on the level of infantry, whether that will percolate up, if you will, that's, I don't know.
Thank you.
May I add just a bit to that? I think it might be.
Yes.
So having, to think about being in DoD, you pick up these things, and I'm sure the dean probably knows even much more than I do. The professional Russian army, the Spetsnaz in particular, are very, very good. And one of the strange things about this particular conflict is that the earlier plan to have them in place internally with the regular foot soldiers, as the professor pointed out, the conscripts following behind or set the battlefield as they see. While they come in, they decapitate the government, and then the rest of what some people would call cannon fodder falls in behind. It didn't work out that way yet, but it's which is why you ended up with this delay, although Putin denies it. What I think you're going to see is it appears in the south and along the entranceways to Odessa that the Spetsnaz and the other forces are now present on the ground and fighting. They've taken some losses, but you're going to see the real professional Russian army up here, and things will get, as I think Macron said, much, much, much worse. And then there'll be the rest of the cannon fodder, the kids basically will follow in behind in patrols, etc. And what they'll do is they'll keep the Ukraine's locked down with most of the violence occurring at night. There has been some dissent actually in Russia. A very good friend of mine, Andrei Kutanov, who was up until very recently was Putin's main foreign policy advisor, published an article that several thousand other foreign policy academics and others in Russia signed off on just a few days ago, and then took the unprecedented step of giving an NPR televised interview in which he said, this is insane, this is unprovoked, and this is unconscionable. He has not been heard from against. And as Professor pointed out, there's now a severe lockdown. So while there are a few in Russia who spoke out early, and I think risked their lives in doing so, I don't think you're going to see much more dissent, and that the avenue that was discussed earlier of the phone calls, even to the families, will probably be curtailed in short order. And this gets to one of the long-term implications, I think. And the one is people question, how great is the Russian army? A, if it has stumbled the way it stumbled, and B, if the only way it can win here is by this scorched earth tactics that we're going to see play out. And then C, the only way that Putin can survive is by isolating Russia. And I think the rest of the world, including some of the countries that were not enthusiastic at the United Nations from the beginning, have now turned and supported United Nations condemnation of what's going to happen. I think you're going to end up with an isolated Russia. And at the end of the day, long-term wise, she can't survive that way. And certainly she is looking across saying, that guy that was just my peer a couple weeks ago, my peer sitting at the Olympics with me, is not nearly as strong as the rest of the world thought he was. He may win Ukraine, but he's lost the rest of the world.
Thank you. We will go to an online question.
Sure, we have have a question about international law, and that's the Russian, starting with the Russian claim that this is a preemptive or preventive self-defense vote. Sounds awfully similar to the US justification for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. From a purely legal perspective, what's the difference between the two positions?
Yeah, so I think the premise of the question would require us to take on two really potentially different topics. And I think it's worthwhile at this point focusing on the Russian situation right now with Ukraine, because that's the topic that we've got in front of us. I don't know that there's a lot to add other than to state very clearly that based on things you've already said in the panel here this morning from everybody participating, that there is no credible basis for Vladimir Putin and Russia to claim self-defense in this situation. There is, to my knowledge, no threat to the Russian sovereign territory and no threat that I'm aware of to even those people who are variously described as separatists or ethnic Russians or whatever that are in Ukraine today. So I think that the claim of self-defense is bogus.
Thank you. In the auditorium, question.
My name is Carter Westfall. I'm a third-year law student here. This question is primarily for Professor Mary Beth Long and Admiral Houck, but the other panelists are welcome to answer as well. I've been reading a lot about Russia not committing enough air assets to gain air superiority. I'm curious what your thoughts are on why they would do this. Is this an act of patience? Is it an act of conserving their air assets? How do you interpret this? Thank you in advance for your answer.
Might defer to Mary Beth. You want to take that? Did you hear the question?
I think early on, there was an effort to deploy troops with air superiority, and Russia took some unexpected losses, including one downing of its plane that had reportedly 100 of its paratroopers on board. I believe that that problem has been solved and that you're going to see, although I'm not sure air superiority at this point is as much the problem as getting Russian munitions to the infrastructure that is targeting. So I think you will see more air and localized bombing of infrastructure and civilians for a psychological campaign going forward. I think there were some initial losses and ill preparedness at the beginning. They were unable, one of the prime targets for Russia was to take the airport outside of Kyiv. And although they did lose it briefly, as of at least a couple of days ago, they no longer controlled it. It's sort of a no man's land. And in fact, Ukraine controlled it, but at least sufficiently enough to keep Russian planes from landing there and dropping off troops and other equipment. But the equipment will be moving in now more on land and very possibly by sea. So it becomes less of an issue than it was. But I think that you'll see an adjustment in the next couple of weeks with much more delivered by air.
Thank you.
Go to online.
Sure, I have another international law question really targeted at Admiral Houck. You touched on some of this in your remarks, but as we see Russia escalate its military tactics, and especially moving from more targeted strikes into more mass casualty kinds of activities, assuming we move that direction, is that going to change the grounds on which the outside world might choose to respond? In other words, might there be a military escalation on the response side as well?
Well, it started off as a question about international law, but became a question about policy and what NATO and the West will do about it. And I don't know that I have a better answer than to say that I think pressure is going to build to do something, because it's not in our nature with 24/7 news coverage to watch this kind of horror continue to go on and for people of good conscience and good faith to sit back and watch it happen. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for policymakers, is to try to craft solutions that will be in some way effective in dealing with Putin without escalating this situation. But again, other panelists want to.
I would just add that I think the stream of refugees that we see already coming out of Ukraine is really just the beginning. I anticipate seeing a stream of people trying to leave Russia as well. And mixed reactions in parts of Eastern Europe, and in other words, complications. I mean, I think there's more openness to accept Ukrainians and perhaps Russians than there were certainly Syrians in Europe. But I mean, handling large numbers of refugee populations poses all kinds of very, very difficult logistical problems for countries that by and large have been the ones that have exported their labor and not haven't been places where people have come to. And so I see the refugee problem as spiraling out of control and creating other problems and all kinds of other tensions.
Thank you. We'll go to a question in the auditorium.
I'm Cody Ford, I'm a first year SIA student, and I personally thank y'all for being here. I think from an American perspective, or at least I think I can speak for many Americans, this whole thing is intensely frustrating. Seeing this thing happen and knowing that for various reasons our hands are tied. I think, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this as well, will conflicts like this in the near future look the same way and that our hands are tied? And if that's the case, what should our role be? Should it be more proactive? Should we revive the old World War II era arsenal of democracy? What can we do to help stop to blunt this sort of thing from happening in the future?
I think, the EU comes in for a lot of criticism for its endless discussions and bureaucracy and the like. But one real accomplishment of the post-war period outside of Yugoslavia has been the fact that it's been a peaceful period. And I do think these kinds of alliances that tie the fates of states together can serve to quell conflicts. And so on one level, I believe this conflict is going to generate new kinds of alliances. And I hope it will generate alliances, and even alliances that have institutional basis and forms of international law where we can establish some kind of norms of expectation, norms of behavior, and mechanisms in place, non-violent mechanisms in place, should those norms not be respected. I think we cannot have a free-for-all whereby anything and everything, when you have 44 million Ukrainians saying we are ready to defend our territory, then the problem is, then are these viable military targets? I suspect the Russians will make exactly that argument. When you have, once again, going back information, when you have films and films of grandmothers saying that they're ready to go out on the streets, then you can take out that grandmother if you need to. And we need to establish that bombing, for example, or fighting in close proximity to a nuclear reactor is something that cannot happen. It happened, and the consequences thus far have not been catastrophic. But what's to say that we will be as lucky next time? So I do think that it's ever more important to create institutions that reach beyond one's own country and that are fundamentally cooperative in nature and that are based on negotiation rather than violent resolution of conflicts.
Thank you. So I am aware of our time, and I'm going to allow one more question from online, and at that point we will close. I apologize again to all of you that are online regarding our technical difficulties, but I'm super appreciative for all of you who've turned out, and I cannot say thank you enough to the panelists, much appreciated, and to everyone who helped pull this together in a very short time span. So thank you. Grant.
Sure, last question then. We saw the image the other day of Zelensky verbally signing the formal application for admission to the European Union. Should that happen? And if it does, what would the consequences be for you?
I think as a sovereign nation, if they would like to apply to be members of the European Union, I think they should be allowed to, just as I would say that about other sovereign nations, which is not to say then that Russia, similarly as a sovereign nation, isn't allowed to voice its dissent in that, in acceding to that application. From a Ukrainian perspective, I think there is enormous amounts to be gained by joining the EU. And arguably, even on the EU side, there's something to be gained. There's already millions of, literally millions. It's hard to exactly know the exact number. There's millions of Ukrainians working illegally and millions more working legally in the EU. They already have visa-free travel. There's already extensive trade. From a Ukrainian perspective, I think they have everything to gain and little to lose. And then here, in terms of Russia, I would delineate between a Kremlin-centered perspective and a popular Russian perspective. From a Kremlin-centered perspective, I think what Russia is, and the Kremlin and Putin and his inner circle, what they are first and foremost afraid of is some kind of a democratic, rule-based form of government on its borders, because should that function and should that deliver a degree of stability and prosperity, that could potentially serve as a model for the 140 million people who live in Russia. And that is precisely what he doesn't want to see. And that's one of the reasons why among his inner circle, of course, you have these oligarchs who are not exclusively citizens of Ukraine. I mean, there are, of course, formidable oligarchs with their massive wealth who are in Ukraine as well, too. So I think from a Kremlin-centered perspective, the EU membership is something that they would certainly like to see thwarted.
Yes, Dean Roush.
Just back up a little bit. It's not just the current active nuclear reactors the problem. It's Chernobyl itself. You heard that vehicles were moving through Chernobyl, raising dust. The woods are alive with radionuclides and drying after climate change, and the kinds of wildfires we see elsewhere in the world are a real threat to that area if it's not well managed. So it's not just the live reactors that are the problem, it's Chernobyl and the woods around it that's the problem.
Thank you. And on that note, we will conclude. I really appreciate it. And I applause Phil's not appropriate, but we'll go ahead and take it and go to the rest of it.